Welcome to Brain Devat. We have a very special episode today because I'm joined by Rebecca Tuvel, who'll be filling in for Jason, and we're going to be interviewing one of our favorite guests, one of our most famous guests, David Benatar, who's just written a book called Very Practical Ethics. And we're going to be talking about one of the more entertaining chapters in the book on bullshit. David, would you like to start with the thought experiment?
No. The thought experiment that I'm tempted to consider is to ask you to imagine a world without bullshit. But that world is just so far removed from our own world that it's actually really hard to do that in thought experiment. So I thought what I'd do instead is tell you a joke. Because after all, a joke is a kind of thought experiment. You're asked to imagine a particular scenario. And this is a joke which is buried in one of the footnotes in the book. And I should tell prospective readers that there are lots of jokes embedded in footnotes for the more scholarly readers who want to go there. There are also a few in the main text, but many more in the notes. So the joke is about a monkey who's sitting on the branch of a tree, and a giraffe comes by and says, "Good morning, Mr. Monkey. What are you doing today?" And the monkey says, "Not much." He says, "Just eating some fruit and picking the fleas off myself and enjoying the sun. But later today, you see that lioness over there? I'm going to go over and I'm going to make passionate love to her." The giraffe says, "Okay, well, have a good day." And he moves on, and a little while later, the elephant comes by and says, "Good morning, Mr. Monkey. What are you doing today?" He says, "Not much." He says, "I'm eating some fruit. I'm picking the fleas off myself. I'm enjoying the sun." He says, "But you see that lioness over there? Later, I'm going to go over and I'm going to pleasure her until she screams with joy." And the elephant says, "Well, okay, have a good day." And a while later, this lion with a massive mane comes up and says, "Good morning, Mr. Monkey." He says, "What are you doing today?" He says, "Not much." He says, "I'm eating some fruit. I'm enjoying the sun, picking the fleas off myself, and talking shit with my friends."
So what I like about the joke is that there are certain situations that will show you to be a bullshitter. That when you have to speak truth in the place of power, namely to the lion, you drop the bullshit. And I wonder if there are things that happen in the real world like that, where it suddenly becomes untenable to be a bullshitter.
I don't know the answer to that, but perhaps what we should do first is just work out a bit about what bullshit is. And there is a bit of a philosophical literature on this question. What I do in my chapter is say a bit about that, but then move on to the distinctly ethical questions about what we ought to do about bullshit, whether we are at liberty ourselves, moral liberty to generate bullshit, what we should do when we see others bullshitting. So perhaps let's look a little bit first at the question about what it is, because if you're going to ask the ethical question, you need first to have determined what it is. And I don't think we can produce a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. Bullshit is, like many concepts, a somewhat fuzzy concept. There has been some theoretical progress that's been made in determining what it is. And I think that at the core of it, we can have a reasonably good idea. But I think there are also going to be kind of peripheral senses, more penumbral senses of bullshit, which sometimes may be unclearly cases of bullshit. It'd be unclear whether they fall within or outside the boundaries or the parameters of the concept. So perhaps I should start off with Harry Frankfurt, who really popularized this field. He was not the first to write about this. There was Max Black, who wrote earlier about bunkum, which I think is really equivalent to bullshit in this context, but just using a more polite word. And for Harry Frankfurt, bullshit is really communicating without regard to the truth. So he wants to differentiate the bullshitter from the liar. This is a common confusion. People think that bullshitting is just really equivalent to lying or to deceiving. And Harry Frankfurt wants to say that's not the case. It's speaking without regard. You're just mouthing off and you don't mind whether it's true or not true. Now, G.A. Cohen was not denying that that is a particular kind of bullshit, but he wanted to differentiate another kind of bullshit, which he calls unclarifiable unclarity. And he thinks that this is a kind of bullshit which is much more common in academia, that people use this very flowery, obscure language, and if you try to clarify what they're saying, you find that it's actually unclarifiable. So it's sort of sheer nonsense, although it's dressed up in very pretentious ways to sound important. And I think those are the two core senses that people often refer to. But we also refer to bullshit of other kinds sometimes. David Graeber's referred to bullshit jobs. You can speak about bullshit tasks. And these are, in a sense, a kind of nonsense, but they're not really linguistic nonsense. They're nonsense of another kind. So that's a little bit of an outline of different views about what it is.
I wanted to ask about the relationship between Cohen's version of bullshit and Frankfurt's version of bullshit. So, how often do you think those who are using flowery, obscure language are also indifferent to the truth?
I don't know. I mean, it's an empirical question, and often one that's really hard to answer because we often don't know whether somebody really does have disregard for the truth. Sometimes it's patently obvious, but there are lots of other things that can lead people into saying things that are not true. And it might not be a disregard for the truth. It might be that they just very gullible, that they've been indoctrinated in some way. And so this is not an easy question. This is something we need to try to diagnose on a case-by-case basis. So to speak about what proportion of the time it's the one and what proportion of the time it's the other and what proportion of the time there's an overlap, I think that's really hard to do.
Yeah, I think that's true. Maybe just to pose the question that I really had in mind while reading your chapter is, like, I wonder how many instances of Frankfurt style bullshit there actually are in the way he defines it as indifference to the truth. It focuses more on creating the impression rather than stating facts. I just wonder how many of these people are actually indifferent to the truth, or like some of the academics just don't think truth with a capital T exists.
Yeah, again, I mean, you're pushing me to answer, but I'm not sure what more I can say beyond what I've said. Again, I can just emphasize that because the Frankfurtian view does say something about a person's mental state, that's often very hard to prove. But as in other cases, we try to read it off behavior. So if you want to say somebody has bad intentions, then you're going to try to read that off the behavior. You're going to look at counterfactual cases. You're going to see a pattern of behavior. So that's generally, I think, how we would try to get into somebody's head, as it were, and determine whether this is bullshit or something akin to it.
And one of the examples that Cohen gives in the academic bullshit case is an extract from Judith Butler. And it's this bizarre string of academic jargon that sort of seems largely incomprehensible. And it seems that in that academic tradition, that postmodern tradition, there's not just a kind of not caring about what's true, there's a contempt for the very notion of truth. The idea that they think you can't ever know what's true. Truth is an irrelevant criterion. Truth is just about power. So there's a sense in which they've gone beyond bullshit. And that way of thinking, that sort of dismissal of truth, that post-truth idea, seems to allow a lot of non-academics to spout bullshit. That if the truth doesn't matter, if the truth is just a matter of, the powerful being able to disseminate an idea and that the underlying facts are irrelevant, that gives a lot of cover to a lot of political commentators, a lot of politicians, a lot of people who are generally able to spout things because they say, well, the higher academics tell us that truth's irrelevant. So they've given us room to say we shouldn't really care whether it's true or not. We're just trying to persuade people to win influence to get our agenda done.
I'm not convinced they've gone beyond bullshit. I think they may be bullshitting us in what they say, because when they say those things, they presumably mean them to be true. And so they've immediately contradicted themselves when they say that. So I don't think this is a way out for them. I'm not denying that they give a lot of people, including themselves, cover for saying a lot of things that are false. But it's not obvious to me that they have gone beyond bullshit. I think there's a strong case to be made, at the very least, that they are engaging in it, or if not in bullshit, then certainly in falsehood.
Yeah, I can't help but think maybe that we might just be talking past those academics who say, well, there's just a deeper debate here about realism and, truth or our ability to access truth. And having studied like these thinkers in grad school a lot, it's just what's necessary in order to understand like the complexity of the view. And maybe that is bullshit. Maybe it's just them being lazy, like try to be clearer, you know?
Yeah, I suppose there's a sense in which you can have two layers of bullshit. So it's hard to work out what the person's saying at all. And then once you decode it, then there's a question as to, well, is that stuff indifferent to the truth? And I suppose that a lot of the bullshit we see floating around is quite understandable, but bullshit nonetheless. Are there particular examples that you think are very prevalent?
One thing I would say, I mean, Jerry Cohen says that bullshit in his sense is unclarifiable unclarity. And one of the things I say in the chapter is that there may also be unclarity that is eventually, after a considerable amount of work, clarifiable. But it still might be a kind of bullshit. In fact, this may be where it verges into the Frankfurtian bullshit, because by speaking in these very convoluted ways, you're trying to convey an impression of yourself as profound. And when that's what you're doing, when you're trying to create an impression about yourself, you're now engaging in a Frankfurtian style bullshit. And it may be that once you clarify what you're saying, it's either mundane or it's false or it's uninteresting. So there can be a kind of crossover there.
Yes, I suppose. So I think you're totally right to say that there's this crossover between the things. And I think the style of delivery is a way of being a particular kind of bullshit artist. But I imagine that, say, non-academics, when they're encountering bullshit, they're often encountering it on social media, in the press, that there's this barrage of information that's put out. Are there particular examples of real-world bullshitting that you think are worth highlighting?
Oh, I mean, there are hundreds, but I'm not sure that all the misinformation that people are getting, let's say on social media, is bullshit for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. It might just be misinformation. Somebody might be purposefully trying to mislead, put that information out there, and then maybe a lot of gullible people who are just taking it in. So particular examples are going to be controversial, in part for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. But let me give you one recent one from the New York Times. And this is a highly respected newspaper. They'd written an article about Kamala Harris's mother and her lab that she ran. And I'll read the quote to you here from this article. It says, "Female mice, the lab's key experimental subjects, received respectful treatment too." This is in addition to the humans. Dr. Goplin Harris referred to them as, quote, "the ladies." In her mouse colony, the traditional gender hierarchy was reversed. Male mice were used mainly for breeding. Students sometimes used the extra males to practice surgeries that they would eventually need to perform on their female counterparts for experiments. Now, there's what seems to me like a host of instances of bullshit here. I mean, first of all, the idea that experimental mice are being treated respectfully, you have to have just completely abandoned any sense of what respectful treatment amounts to. So that's one problem. The other is that the claim that the gender hierarchy has been reversed and that male mice are being used mainly for breeding. I mean, this is just absurd. If you understand anything about biology, you really need one male to fertilize large numbers of females, and you can't do it the other way around. So to the extent that they were using males just for breeding purposes, you're now going to have a lot of excess mice that are now being experimented on, which only reinforces the point about the disrespect towards the mice, because it's even more gratuitous and more wasteful. Now, what strikes me is that here's a respected newspaper. It obviously heard this account from somebody, the relevant journalist, and includes this in the report, and there's no evaluation of it, no engagement of it. It's just a repetition of it because it's a nice-sounding idea. It fits with the narrative that they want to have. And so that looks to me like it's an example of indifference to the truth. Can I be certain that the journalist was indifferent to the truth? No, but it looks like that to me.
So what strikes me about that example is that it's infused with a narrative, as you say. So there's a hesitancy to go and probe the facts because it sounds very nice. Actually, this is this wonderful gender-affirming place of mice torture. So, we're doing a wonderful thing here, so we don't need to ask too many questions. And I wonder if that's often the source of bullshit, is that there is a political agenda. It could be a right-wing agenda or a left-wing agenda that pushes a certain kind of way of being. And because of that, you stop caring about the facts. You just want to make sure your side wins or your view gets out through some other story. And so you don't ask too many questions.
I think that's true. It's often politically motivated, but not always. I think often it's personally motivated. It's about an ego wanting to create a certain impression. And so the person just jabbers off in pursuit of cultivating and reinforcing that impression without regard for the truth. So there can be multiple motivations.
There's been such interesting work recently about concepts that I think of as falling under the class of bullshitting. So I'm thinking of Brandon Warmke and Justin Tosey's book on moral grandstanding, and they define grandstanding as, using moral discourse to elevate one's social status or for, reputational aims. Or I think of trolling on the internet, where it seems quite clear that people who are trolling are not interested in the truth. They're just trying to kind of rile people up or, piss them off. And those strike me as very pervasive instances of bullshit.
Sounds like it. I've not read that particular book, but it does sound like it.
Yeah, it seems that bullshit's this, as you mentioned in the beginning, a term that encompasses a range of different ways of being. You give the example of like a bullshit job or a bullshit task. And I thought that was kind of interesting, the idea that you've got something that's ultimately indifferent to result. So you have a case of, the government sending off an email to people to ask them to do something that's impossible to do, or to send a reminder out that the internet will be off while it's off. And so people only receive it, once the internet goes back on. Things that are just meaningless, that a lot of the tasks that people do in their jobs never achieve anything. They're just perpetual motion machines or Rube Goldberg devices. And I think it's worth identifying that stuff. And I suppose if it landed on people that what they were engaged in was largely bullshit, that their lives then lacked meaning because they were engaged in bullshit tasks, speaking bullshit, that that realization either makes you want to lead a life full of meaning, or the bullshit isn't only in service of something like a paycheck, which allows you to go and do things that you think are actually meaningful.
That's true. I think it's probably more true of the bullshit jobs. I think the bullshitter, the bullshit artist, the person that's generating bullshit, often does get very material rewards for doing so. And so they often don't want to abandon their bullshitting. In fact, I think this is what explains just why there is as much bullshit as there is. It's because it's just so rewarding. But it's so easy. If you have to worry about speaking truthfully, you have to be very careful in your claims and very qualified, and you have to attend to empirical evidence, and it may be very difficult to interpret what that evidence is. This is an exhausting process. Whereas if you can just talk without regard to the truth, you can do that the drop of a hat. It's really easy to do. And then there are lots of benefits that come with it. And so that, I think, is why there's so much of it. There's something adaptive about it.
Yeah. This makes me think about the overlap between like bullshitting and bullying, or maybe what we might think of as a kind of epistemic bullying, where basically you'd be scared into calling out the bullshit, which you describe as having very high social costs. And if we think of bullying as sort of exerting pressure on people to adopt the right views, or they'll get canceled or called out otherwise, maybe some of this more pernicious form of bullshitting, especially in the internet age, is connected to bullying. I wonder.
I certainly think that that's true sometimes. I think sometimes there's something more subtle going on. In other words, we can either have a narrow or a broader conception of what constitutes bullying. If you have a very broad conception of bullying, then you might say that the silencing effect on people not to call out bullshit is an instance of bullying. But maybe that's just too broad a sense of bullying. Then if we narrow the conception of bullying, then we're going to need to say that sometimes when the silencing effects are going on, it's not really a product of bullying, it's something else. And I think that's probably the more plausible way to go. I think given that humans are social beings, they're going to be liable to social pressures, and not all social pressures will constitute bullying.
So you can imagine living in a society where bullshit is very pervasive. So if you lived under the yoke of communism and everybody was told that this is a wonderful system and everybody is totally prosperous and the West is, just filled with decay and perversion and, things are much worse there, that a lot of people knew this to be false, but went along with the bullshit because the costs of speaking out were so big that if you were a dissident to the systemic bullshit, you could pay with your life or you could be sent off to a gulag. Um, and it seems that the cost of pushing back against the bullshit would be, very onerous. And I suppose there's a couple of questions about what one ought to do in relation to bullshit. How much of an obligation is there on us to speak out against it, to call bullshit? And are there good methods for doing it? Because calling bullshit in its own right might be a way of stopping a fruitful conversation, that calling bullshit itself might be bullshit. So having the right conversational norms so you can actually find out, what's really going on here, what's true, how to deal with that in a civil way without having these external forces that make the conversation difficult seem important and very hard to do in societies where there's consequences for being a dissident.
So you're raising a number of different issues there, but they're all related to the question about what we ought to do about bullshit. And I do think it depends in part on the nature of the society you're in, and therefore what costs are attaching to calling out other people's bullshit. But the first thing I think we need to do is to be reasonably confident that what we're calling out is in fact bullshit. And there are very many cases where there's going to be disagreement between people about whether we're dealing with a particular instance of bullshit or not. Sometimes that disagreement is going to be reasonable, and sometimes it's not going to be. And so one of the things I say in the book is you do want to have a reasonably good case for thinking that something is bullshit before you're going to call somebody out on it. And I also give a bit of practical advice to say sometimes what you can do is you can not call it explicitly, but ask people questions. Do you really mean that? What about this? What about that? And you can try to sort of push them either to give it all up or to clarify what they're saying or to justify what they're saying or to confirm in your mind that they are in fact bullshitting. So there are delicate ways of going about this. But when you are dealing with a pretty clear-cut case, it is going to depend what the costs are. And I don't want to underestimate the costs even in the freest societies because they can be pretty life-altering for the bullshit caller, the person who's calling out somebody else's bullshit. But of course, we've got duties to do things not only when there's no cost attached to it. Those are clear-cut cases where you could do some good or prevent some harm at no cost to yourself. But once the costs are there, once there are some costs, doesn't mean you immediately have no duty. So you have to sort of weigh up what the costs are against other considerations. I think the costs can get sufficiently bad, like in those highly repressive states, that you're just not going to be obligated to call it out. That's just asking too much of you.
Yeah, this is a theme I think that runs through your book, which is concerned with all of these very practical, ethical dilemmas and situations that confront us in our everyday lives, namely the balance between individual responsibility and the collective action problem. So I love that you refer to like the tragedy of the bullshit commons, and maybe you can define that in relation to individual responsibility.
Thanks. I think you're quite correct to identify this as a theme that runs through. And in fact, it's more than that, in that I think that what duty you have in any one of these areas might depend in part on what costs you're absorbing in other areas. Because the question about what you're obliged to do in your life, as it were, has to take account of sacrifices you're making in other places. So, I don't know, if you're a really powerful person with lots of resources, you can sometimes afford more reputational damage than if you're a person who's eking out an existence, reliant on employment, which you might lose if you were to speak out. And so I do think it makes a difference. Now, the tragedy of the bullshit commons is obviously a play on the commons, where every individual has an interest in using the commons to graze their herds. But when everybody makes use of the commons in that way, the commons get depleted, and it's to everybody's general detriment. And so the bullshit commons is that every individual has got some interest in bullshitting, but that if everybody bullshits, we're in a much worse world than we otherwise would be. And so the question is how you break that deadlock, as it were, and produce the general interest in reducing the amount of bullshit.
Yeah, that's great. You often hear people say in the context of academic bullshit that people with tenure, people who are in secure positions on college campuses have a heightened duty to be courageous and speak out against bullshit of many varieties. And this it strikes me that actually, if you're in an academic context or a context where what we're doing explicitly is trying to understand the world or gain knowledge or truth or some epistemic or knowledge related value, then you do have a heightened duty to speak out. And this is what the Why It's Okay to Speak Your Mind book by Joshi argues as well, which is that you have like a defeasible duty to speak your mind. And, of course, there are lots of occasions maybe where it won't be required, but in order for our epistemic commons, as he calls it, like to be healthy, you do need people to contribute their evidence to like the larger social context. And I think that would be especially true in universities.
I think that's right. But I also think that those people who think that tenured academics are immune to severe consequences for speaking out are very much mistaken.
That's true too, which has led me to wonder whether this actually is a duty that we should think of more broadly, because oftentimes like untenured or more junior folks will think, oh, I better not speak out. And then this contributes to the commons problem that you've described. Everybody gets the social norm, don't speak out. When I first got to my college, I was told, oh, careful what you say in the faculty meetings and whatnot. But increasingly, I've seen younger pre-tenured or untenured people speaking out. I think there is a general kind of frustration at this point with some of the silencing censorious elements in academia.
Well, we can only hope that's right, but there's a curious sort of paradox here, because the more people are doing it, the less courage it takes to speak out. It's when you really are the lone voice that it takes the most courage and where it's most dangerous. But getting past that threshold where you can begin to build up a critical mass of people who are willing to speak out, that's really important. I also think it's important to distinguish between the individual's duty to call out particular, let's say, instances of bullshit in this case, and then individuals' responsibility to create the climate in which it's easier to do so. And sometimes it's going to be easier to do the latter than the former, or it's going to be less costly to do the latter than the former. So it's something to consider as well.
Well, I hold in my hands a wonderful book about bullshit at universities, written by someone who is willing to put their life on the line and push back against the bullshit. For those of you who haven't seen our episode on it, it's The Fall of the University of Cape Town by David Benatar. And you touch on the bullshit at UCT in this chapter on bullshit. And a lot of what you do in the book is anti-bullshit. It's to say, let's find out what's actually going on. Let's ask the right questions. It's a heavily research book that I gather took you a number of years of careful, hard work, which shows you the asymmetry of the bullshit problem. The bullshitter just sort of espouses away, and you have to go and spend years trying to show why they're wrong. The particular examples that you deal with in the chapter on bullshit relate to free speech and the lines that were given to explain why, in the name of academic freedom, we need to disallow someone from speaking, or why it's a curatorial choice to censor the following statues. If you could tell us more about that, that'd be wonderful.
I can refer to one of the cases which on its face is so suggestive of bullshit. And this was the vice chancellor at the University of Cape Town, equivalent to the president of a university in America, cancelling an academic freedom lecture and doing so on the justification that allowing the lecture would retard rather than advance academic freedom. Now, it's sort of harder to get a more patently obvious case of bullshit. But to really see that it is bullshit, you need to look into the details that are provided in much more detail in that book. And I encourage people who want to look at the particular examples to go and do that. But you referred earlier to the asymmetry, and I do in the chapter refer to Alberto Brandolini's bullshit asymmetry principle, which I'll just explicate now. It's that the amount of energy necessary to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it. And this is the problem, is that when somebody offers some bullshit, the bullshit buster has to come along and start doing the analysis and providing the evidence. And then invariably what happens is the bullshit artist responds. And because it's so much easier to respond, the bullshit artist can just clog up the plumbing works much quicker than the bullshit plumber can clear them out. And so it's a very real problem.
Yeah. That makes me think about how this problem extends to speaker invitations on campuses and how it can often be much harder to put together like a panel of experts and people who are really well versed in being careful and nuanced about a given highly charged topic versus how easy it can be to recruit like an advocate or an activist to come to your campus and make their case. And so there's that asymmetry of effort there in relation to bullshit.
Correct. And also to evaluating what you hear, because if you think about the forum of a panel, there's only going to be so much nuance that you can get into. It's like with this discussion that we're having now. There's only so much that can be done in an hour-long discussion. If you've got a contestation of views on the panel, you have two experts whose expertise hopefully is going to far exceed that of the audience. And now the audience have to sift through these nuances and try to work out where the truth lies between them. And that's difficult. Much easier to cheer for one team or another.
I think that's part of the concern, is that there's a lot of contrary views that are espoused. If you're a layperson without expertise, you might say, well, I don't know how to adjudicate between these things. So I'm going to try and use a barometer, which is I read this newspaper and it tends to go along with how I generally feel. So I'll trust whatever their views are, which may very well allow that newspaper to be hijacked by logical forces. And it also may mean that your bullshit detection skills have been surrendered to an authority that isn't actually a good authority on it. Or what it can do is lead to a general distrust of experts. So it might be you say, well, experts agree with each other all the time, so I guess they don't really know what they're talking about. They're just bullshit artists, because you can't distinguish when there are actually valid forms of reasonable disagreement between people in a rarefied field. And so it's quite difficult to determine when you're dealing with, let's say, a reasonable disagreement between people and actual bullshit if you're outside of that area of discipline. I think, especially in the sciences, I imagine for a lot of people who haven't worked out what a good study is, what protocols you should use, they're going to see newspaper headlines that say, this kind of food is going to give you cancer, and 3 weeks later it turns out that someone else has got a different approach, and they don't know how to adjudicate those things. You've got let's say some expert who's written something very carefully, has gone through all the correct methodology. Their university sort of has a PR agent who writes something up, which then goes to a newspaper, and by the time you read the end product, all the elements of truth that could possibly be there have just been watered down, and you've just got a kind of feel good bit of bullshit floating around, and it becomes very hard to differentiate whether it's true or not.
I think that's true.
Do you think satire can be a form of bullshit? And if so, I think it might be my favorite form of bullshit. But like, can you think of an example where maybe it would qualify?
I'm not sure that it is, because I'm not sure it fits into any of the conceptions of bullshit that I've referred to. But if it sometimes is, I think it's then of the innocuous kind. So one example I give is the bullshit generator. And every time you refresh the page, it produces a new postmodern article title and article. And what it's generating is, on the face of it, looks bullshit, but it's being generated as satire. It's being produced in order to satirize actual bullshit. So it's not clear to me that we would call the satire bullshit. But if we did, this is innocuous at worst, and at best actually positive, because it has a positive bullshit calling function.
Yeah. As I asked that question, I was like, well, I think oftentimes people who are being satirical or deliberately using jokes or ridicule have the intention of exposing the flaws or the ignorance in a lot of the bullshitters' claims. And so they're doing something salutary as far as truth seeking is concerned. And it might be that that is the most effective way to respond to bullshitting. I think of this online, like oftentimes the most successful responses to trolls or people who are just trying to, rile folks up is to kind of be funnier than them, right? Instead of just taking them seriously and trying to respond with facts, which is exactly what they're mocking. You kind of go a level above and make fun of what they're doing, but do it better than them. So often, I think that might be more effective. So it's like maybe there are also ways of using humor to respond to bullshit effectively.
I agree. I still think humor is an excellent way of responding to bullshit and a lot of other things as well. That's what I'm inclined to think that something like the postmodern generator is not best viewed as bullshit, but rather as a lampooning of bullshit.
So one of the other chapters in your book is around language and our language norms, and you have a section on the use of slurs against groups. And I have a feeling that our approach to thinking about the use of slurs involves some kind of bullshit. So in the chapter, you talk about the importance of the use-mention distinction, that there's a difference between using a slur to denigrate someone and merely mentioning the slur, maybe to denounce it. And that if you drop this distinction, you have something like a blasphemy norm. And you give the wonderful case in Life of Brian of saying the word Jehovah. And you have, a whole bunch of women dressed up as men who are holding rocks in their hands, who are just bloodthirsty, waiting to, stone to death a blasphemer. And as the high priest sort of describes the crime, he mentions the word Jehovah and he gets stoned. And then someone in the crowd sort of mentions the word and they get stoned. And the poor guy who's there to be put to death says, all I did was say that this halibut was fit for Jehovah, and he gets stoned. And it seems that kind of blasphemy norm has erupted when it comes to the use of certain words. And in the chapter, you sort of avoid using the words that are now very blasphemous in North America, and you give some others that were, let's say, blasphemous at a period of time, and now less so. Words like kike and mick and wop and dago. And a lot of viewers love to go and look what those words refer to because they're not commonly used. All of us on the call are Jewish, so we feel quite comfortable, using the word kike as an example. But where I think the bullshit stems from is in the pious person who says it's never acceptable to ever use a word like that under any circumstances whatsoever. That if it's in some work of literature, like To Kill a Mockingbird, well, the best thing to do, of course, would be to never say the words out loud, or to even reprint all those books so that we don't use the offensive word, because there is no distinction between, using a word and mentioning it. And I think that's bullshit. I think that that kind of pious approach is a way of pretending that you're holier than thou. You understand the distinction, but you pretend not to.
Right. So you drew the use-mention distinction, but then you often use the word use instead of mention when you really meant mentions. So I get into these complexities in that chapter, and I also get into distinctions between use and use, because I don't think that all uses are equivalent. Now, what about the question about whether people who are sort of virtue signaling about this are bullshitters? I think there's a case to be made that they are, in the Frankfurtian sense, and in part because they're trying to create a certain impression about themselves. Now, I don't want to exclude the possibility that there are some people who are not merely trying to do that. In other words, they actually believe that there's something wrong with the mere mention of certain words. That is a possibility. And then I suppose I would not be inclined to say that they bullshitting, but I would be inclined to say they're wrong for the reasons that are outlined in the chapter on language.
I suppose I wonder about why a norm like that can suddenly take hold. That it was the case that for a long time people were able to quite freely articulate their ideas by using words that in a certain context are derogatory. And we managed to shift that norm within the last couple of years, quite dramatically so. I think there's cases of network executives saying, we should maybe have some policy on whether people are allowed to use the word, they utter the word, and then they get fired. It seems like a crazy case. Or There was someone who worked at the New York Times who was talking to a bunch of students on a school trip, and they gave an example of someone who used the word, and he said, well, and he utters the word and says, that's a pretty terrible thing. They shouldn't have done that. Adam Abib, who was the vice chancellor at the University of Witwatersrand, had a similar incident, went through a disciplinary when he moved to SOAS. How does that kind of norm take hold when the conceptual stuff's not that hard to understand? So how does the bullshitting sort of manage to cloud out the reason?
I don't know the answer to that question, but what I can observe is that which particular words trigger people and are regarded as taboo change. And so we tend to be rather smug and think that we've overcome all these primitive ideas that people had in the past, where they'd stone people for blasphemy, or at least in some parts of the world. But that's not the case. It may be that we're not stoning people and for blasphemy, but we are going to cancel them for mentioning words that are regarded today as taboo. And so it's really just the words that have shifted, not the psychological or social practice. And that suggests there's something pretty deep in humanity about that. It's regrettable, it's unfortunate, it needs to be called out. Whether it's bullshit or not, it needs to be called out. And that's what I've tried to do. Now, you're correct that I haven't even mentioned the most offending words. And that's really just a strategic task, because given the levels of pathology that we have, my mentioning some of those words is just going to be a distraction from actually getting clarity on the issues. And so I've mentioned slurs and mentioned the use of slurs that are now mentionable. So it's just a strategic question there.
Going back to the example at UCT of the vice chancellor who defended the decision to cancel the talk by saying that bringing Mr. Rose to campus might retard rather than advance academic freedom on campus. It would have been so funny. Maybe this actually did happen if people jumped on him for using the word retard or retard, which is certainly one of these words that can not only not be used, but even mentioned in many contexts.
Look, Rebecca, this is a very civilized show, and we don't use the R word on our show. And there's no instance ever when you should ever be uttering a word like that. It is so deeply offensive. I mean, I'm just tearing my hair out that you would even utter that syllable from your mouth. It's just distasteful, terrible.
Well, you said that I used it when in fact I mentioned it. If you want to hear me use it, I will say that you are the biggest retard I know, Mark Oppenheimer.
So yeah, there was actually no consequence to that. I think appropriately, of course. There's also a difference between it being used as a noun and it being used as a verb. He was using it as a verb there. But thankful for small mercies when people can recognize those sorts of distinctions.
I think one of my favorite comics who points out bullshit is Aziz Ansari in the Netflix special Right Now. It's from 2019. It's really astute social commentary, and he points out kind of tons of instances of what I imagine you would say are bullshit. So Aziz Ansari says, quote, "It's a weird time to be working on jokes. Got to be very careful about what you say, right? I've seen people in regular jobs getting in trouble these days. I saw some people get in trouble for saying the word niggardly, which, take it easy, has nothing to do with race. It just means cheap or stingy. You can look up the etymology. It's a completely innocent word, and people are getting in trouble for it, which is crazy. But it seems like they could have just said cheap or stingy, right? I don't know why you had to walk the plank on that one. I know what it sounds like, but I want to use my big word." One of the guys that got in trouble was a senator from Ohio, right? His name's Sherrod Brown. They had a meeting about military spending, and he said, "When it comes to spending on the weapons and the wars, you all want to spend very lavishly. But when the veterans come home, you start acting very niggardly." And they're like, "What did you say?" I said, "You just start acting very niggardly." Just that last word again, Sherrod. I said, niggardly. Get him out of here. And he got in all this trouble. And then they looked it up in the dictionary, and he was fine. When I first read the article, I was really confused because I read his name as Sherrod Brown. And I was like, seems like Sherrod Brown should be okay here, right? Oh, it's a white guy? Get him out of here.
Yes, I mean, that's interesting because anybody using that or any other word that might offend in an innocent way is obviously not having thought about how it might be interpreted. They're just using the word. It's a word in their vocabulary. They're using it. They're not intending it in the negative way that it's then interpreted. I'm not saying there are never people who are trying to skate the line and to push boundaries. There clearly are, and that includes many comedians.
So one of the instances of bullshit that I've found very prevalent during this year has been on reporting around the Israel-Gaza conflict. So I was asked quite often this year to talk about the legal case, the ICJ case, and found it was very difficult because you're dealing with a specialist area. You're dealing with not just any law, but law from an international tribunal. And in order to try and provide an honest assessment of what that court was finding, it was difficult wading through all the bullshit. So, for example, you'd have press lines, specifically in South Africa, saying things like South Africa wins its case at the ICJ, genocide found by the ICJ. You'd have people who appeared to have expertise making these sorts of claims. Former public protector, for example, who's regarded as one of the great lawyers in South Africa, boldly claiming this. But in order to debunk it, it would require reading a judgment that's 80 pages long, reading the original documentation, reading minority judgments, listening to judges' extracurrial statements about what they actually meant, all of which requires an enormous amount of work. And you're dealing with a very hot topic, a politically charged topic. People have strong views on which team they want to support. And it seems then difficult to try and work out what's really true. And there have been a couple of people who've professionally dedicated themselves to saying, let's find out what's true, let's cut through the bullshit. But this steaming piles of bullshit on topics like this make it very, very hard for average citizens who have no particular dog in the fight to work out, well, what's really gone on. Do you think that there are good methods people can use to try and cut through the bullshit for their own sake, if they're not going to speak out against it, but they want to try and work out, well, I don't want to believe bullshit. I want to believe what's true. What should they do? What are the good mental hygiene practices that they should be adopting?
I suppose in a sense what you're asking me is how do people develop their critical thinking skills? And that's a big topic. But I'll give a few examples, and I can't go through everything, of course. But one is to read a variety of views and a variety of sources. Because I think one of the problems is, of course, that people are in echo chambers. If you only read the New York Times, you'll get a certain impression of what's going on, let's say, in Israel's war with Gaza. Whereas if you read other news sources, including many Israeli news sources, including across the political spectrum, you'll get a very different view. You'll get things covered that are not covered in the New York Times and vice versa. So a diversity of sources is going to be important. I also think it's important to differentiate different kinds of claims. So in this particular case, there's a question about what the court found, and then there's a question about what's actually going on. And depending on which question you're trying to investigate, you will need to look at different kinds of evidence. One shortcut to the first answering the first question are the subsequent public statements that were made by the then head of the court, where she clarified what the court had and had not said. Now, this is a pretty authoritative person. There's no reason to expect bias on her part. She's giving a layperson's explanation of the legal judgment. So that's a way to sort of short circuit much of the answering of that particular question. But questions about what's actually going on, that's a lot harder because you're getting quite divergent views from different sides. You're getting the United Nations saying one thing, you're getting the IDF saying another thing. There are questions also involving what people's intentions are, which, as we were discussing earlier, is really difficult. And so one of the things you're going to have to face up to is sometimes you may just not be able to decide. You may just not know because you may not have enough reliable information. Yeah, those are just a few examples. Obviously, you need to look for contradictions between what people are saying, the plausibleness, the reasonableness, weighing it up against other evidence that you have. There are a whole range of things you need to do, but I'm not going to be able to cover that in a few minutes in Brain in a Vat. It's a good reason for people to go out and learn a bit more about critical thinking.
I think this problem that you named, Mark, is the most terrifying problem of our age, not only in relation to the war in the Middle East, but any major political and global crisis, people really don't know what to believe. There's so much disinformation and misinformation out there that, to the degree that I don't even know if it's appropriate to hold people accountable. I mean, some of my discussions on things like the Middle East have ended in just a mutual acknowledgement that we're pulling from different sources and it's really not clear what the facts are. I mean, it's not to say that you can't try to get at the truth, but even academics are struggling with this, like people who supposedly are quite good at getting at the truth. And I keep coming back to T. Nguyen's distinction between echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. So he says an epistemic bubble is just what happens when you don't hear people from the other side, just like an informational network in which some information has been omitted, but you could correct that by, say, reading articles from the contrary point of view. But an echo chamber, he defines as a structure from which other relevant voices have been like actively discredited, or you actively don't trust people from the other side. So if you were to read what they said, you would kind of hate read it or treat it as obvious bunk. If that's our problem, then like the solution is that much harder to identify, and because you can't just correct it by giving people, different perspectives.
This is all fascinating, but I just wanted to flag that we shouldn't be treating every disagreement as a disagreement about whether there's bullshit. Just wanted to remind our listeners of that.
Maybe disinformation, like people who are deliberately trying to mislead by like poisoning the epistemic commons with a bunch of falsehoods, or maybe that's where bullshitting is relevant.
I think deliberately misleading would be different from bullshit. And then, of course, not all misinformation is a result of deliberate misleading, because there are some people who in good faith receive the deliberate deception, but they can't see it as such. And so they now repeat it and amplify it. I don't think they're bullshitting, and I don't think they're deliberately deceiving, but they are contributing to misinformation and the spread of misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate pointing out that you can have an ecosystem which makes it harder to distinguish truth from bullshit, that might also change the conversational norms, that might encourage people to feel more comfortable bullshitting because they care more about their team winning, that they feel that it's a fair strategy to invoke in the face of the other side's alleged misinformation, that they would rather, through gusto and, demeanor, sort of try and win, and so feel that they're entitled to be bullshitting more. So I think they're connected concepts. And I think thinking about ways to evaluate truth, to be a more critical thinker are important. And I think those things are going to apply to countering bullshit and working out, how do I determine if this information is, deliberate misinformation? Has it been planted? How do I evaluate that sort of stuff? The difference between being a conspiracy theorist and being skeptical about what's present, and as you say, we're now in an age where information is so readily available. You can find things out very quickly, but to find out whether it's good information requires an enormous amount of effort. And that requires all the hard work of being able to sift through things, putting on a bullshit detector, understanding what's true, being able to do the research, looking at different sources, all of which requires work. And it's maybe possible that you're only able to do it in your own niche little field, the thing that you care about. And then once something comes up in another area, you imbibe it and you sort of hope it's true. But it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation thinking about the topic. And I have to say that the book itself is just such a wonderful resource for people who care about trying to lead an ethical life. And that a lot of books on applied ethics topics tend to deal with things like the death penalty or abortion, big life or death questions. And that the nature of this book is that it's ethics for every day, that it's the kind of issues that everybody will encounter all the time in their lives. And I imagine it'll be a wonderful resource for many listeners of the show. A show we cover, I'd say at least half of our episodes are applied ethics questions. And this is such a enjoyable, fun read and such an easily accessible read. largely bullshit free, I'll say. Besides the chapter on bullshit, everything is so easy to understand. There's no incomprehensible sections, and will be a wonderful teaching resource for others. So it's been fantastic having both of you on the show. And Rebecca's always a wonderful guest, and thank you so much for stepping into the fray of being a co-host.
Well, thanks to both of you. And Mark, I don't mind being accused of writing about bullshit as long as I'm not accused of writing bullshit.